Metaphor in Religious Language, Janet Martin Soskice. Metaphor in religious language moves from the history and philosophy of metaphor to the question of whether religious language can be cognitively serious in reality, depicting without pretending to define God. Janet Martin Soskice first separates metaphor from model, symbol, analogy, myth, and other neighboring forms. She then argues that metaphor is not ornament, but a conceptual vehicle whose associative and model-generating force can disclose what cannot be said in any other way. The final movement places this account beside scientific realism and develops a cautious theological realism grounded in experience, community, and tradition. Abstract. Janet Martin Soskice, Metaphor in Religious Language, Clarendon Press, 1985, is a philosophical and theological study of metaphor's cognitive work. It begins with Aristotle, Quintilian, and the substitution tradition, moves through problems of definition and contemporary theories of metaphor, and then places metaphor among model, symbol, analogy, simile, synecdoche, metonymy, catachresis, myth, and allegory. The second half turns to scientific models, theories of reference, critical realism, and a theological question of whether speech about God can be reality, depicting without claiming to define the transcendent. Soskice's answer is an interanimative account. Metaphor is a form of language use in which one subject is spoken of through the associative networks and model-generating force of another. Its meaning belongs to the whole utterance in context, not to a detachable metaphorical sense of an isolated word. Its reference is made by speakers and communities, not divided among the terms of the sentence. Because metaphor can give semantic form to what has no settled name. Its irreducibility is not a defect, but a condition of its cognitive usefulness. The study culminates in a cautious theological realism that can speak of God without pretending to comprehend him. Executive summary. Metaphor begins where a simple naming theory of language begins to fail. A bottle has a neck, a river a mouth, an evening can become the old age of the day, and a scattered flame can be named by borrowing the language of sewing. These are not merely ornaments hung on thoughts already complete. They show language extending itself toward what it has not yet learned to say. The old philosophical suspicion that metaphor is a decorative substitute for words proper therefore mistakes the order of things. Often the metaphor is not a translation of a prior literal thought, but the means by which a new thought becomes available. Its subject is one, its associative networks plural, and its force lies in the model that lets the hearer go on. From this account follows the book's theological pressure. Metaphor must be distinguished from model, symbol, analogy, simile, myth, and allegory, but must not be reduced to any of them. It must be understood as language use, yet not confined to a word or grammatical form. It must be cognitively serious, yet not mistaken for an exhaustive definition. Scientific language supplies the parallel. Field, particle, gene, programming, and feedback can guide inquiry toward structures not directly observed without becoming privileged mirrors of the world. Religious language can therefore be reality depicting in a cautious, fallibilist, communal sense. To say that God is Father, Spirit, King, Rock, or living water is not to capture God in a picture, nor to retreat into human feeling alone. It is to point through a tradition's experience and models toward a transcendent source, speaking in the only kind of language finite creatures possess, tentative, inherited, revisable, and alive with more than one can finally say. Central thesis. The book's central thesis is that metaphor is a cognitive vehicle, not a decorative substitute. It speaks about one thing in terms suggestive of another, but the relation is not a simple comparison between two already known subjects. The whole utterance interanimates terms, context, intention, shared associations, and latent models. The metaphor may disclose a resemblance not previously noticed, name what lacks a lexical term, or make a state of affairs accessible for the first time. Its meaning cannot be recovered without loss by stripping away the vehicle and retaining a supposedly pure tenor. This thesis becomes a defense of theological realism only after Soskice has separated reference from definition. A speaker or community may refer to a reality without possessing an exhaustive or unrevisable description of it. Scientific realism shows how model-generated terms can provide epistemic access to independent structures while remaining revisable. Theological realism applies the same conceptual possibility, not as a proof of God, but as a defense of the right to speak of God. Metaphor does not define the divine. It points through experience, language, tradition, and communal interpretation toward the transcendent source Christians confess. Foundational observations. Metaphor is language use. Metaphor is a figure of speech, not a mental event, physical object, or free-floating image. Its effects may reach beyond the utterance, but its work begins in linguistic use. The whole utterance matters. Metaphorical construal belongs to the semantic and pragmatic setting of the utterance. Speaker intention, hearer competence, shared beliefs, and context determine whether an unusual phrase is metaphor, nonsense, or accustomed speech. Tenor and vehicle are not two subjects. The tenor is the subject matter being spoken of. The vehicle is the associative and model-bearing language through which it is illuminated. The metaphor has unity of reference and plurality of associations. Models generate metaphorical terms. A model need not be linguistic, but speech made on its basis becomes metaphorical. The brain-as-computer model generates programming, feedback, input, and storage as a theoretical vocabulary. Tropes differ by cognitive function. Metonymy and synecdoche make oblique reference, while metaphor can organize a new network of thought. Simile ranges from illustration to modeling. Catachresis fills lexical gaps. Analogy stretches accustomed speech without imaginative strain. Living and dead metaphor. Living metaphors retain tension, resist paraphrase, and suggest models. Dead metaphors become accustomed and lexicalized, though their latent models may still structure thought. Irreducibility is productive. A metaphor's inability to collapse into a literal equivalent without loss is evidence of its relational content. Its implications can be extended, tested, and interpreted even when no single paraphrase replaces it. Cautious realism. Metaphorical theory terms may be reality depicting without being exhaustively descriptive. Reference is fallible, social, and tradition-shaped, but it need not vanish because definition is incomplete. Significance and recommendation. The book matters because it refuses two easy escapes: the claim that metaphor is only emotion, and the claim that metaphor gives a transparent view of what it names. It is especially valuable for theologians, philosophers of religion, literary critics, and students of science who need to distinguish model from metaphor, reference from definition, and cognitive force from literalistic certainty. Soskice's argument is demanding, and its 1985 debates with analytic philosophy, new hermeneutics, and scientific realism reward slow reading. The payoff is a disciplined middle position in which religious language can be both humble about the transcendence of God and serious about the reality toward which it points. Read it alongside Richards, Black, Ricoeur, and McFague, but let Soskice's distinctive achievement remain visible. The metaphor is not a failed literal statement. It is a way of thinking into a world not otherwise available. Chapter 1. Classical Accounts of Metaphor. Aristotle and Quintilian. The study of metaphor begins with the study of language itself. The Greek term metaphora means a carrying across. A word moves from an original application into another, as when the neck of a man becomes the neck of a bottle, or the mouth of a man becomes the mouth of a river. From its earliest appearance, then, metaphor is not merely an ornament added to finished speech. It extends the resources of language and raises the question of how words are fastened to the world. Naturally, as the naturalists claimed, or by convention, as their opponents maintained. This is why metaphor belongs beside the ancient disputes over physis and nomos, nature and convention, and beside the elaborate etymologies by which thinkers tried to recover the true meaning of a word. The danger of such etymologizing is already visible in Plato's playful treatment of the word for body, a fanciful derivation may disclose an image, but does not thereby establish current meaning. The history of a word and its present use are not the same thing. Metaphor exposes the difference, because one word can work beyond the object or application with which a simple naming theory would associate it. Aristotle's account in the Poetics remains the classical point of departure. He describes metaphor as the transferred use of a term belonging properly elsewhere, and distinguishes movements from genus to species, species to genus, species to species, and analogy. His examples include the evening as the old age of the day and old age as the evening of life. He also notices a case in which a word is lacking. Just as scattering seed is called sowing, the scattering of light by the sun may be called sowing the God-created flame. Metaphor can therefore name what has no established name. Yet Aristotle's classification does not map neatly on a later taxonomies. Some of his instances would now be called synecdoche or hyperbole, and his account speaks of metaphor among kinds of names or nouns rather than as a phenomenon of the whole utterance. Soskice does not dismiss him for failing to ask modern questions. She asks instead what his account was trying to do. Aristotle was writing for poets, and for him, the excellence of metaphor lies in the perception of resemblances that cannot simply be taught as a rule. Quote, "It is extremely important to use in the proper place each of the kinds I have mentioned, but by far the most important is to be good at metaphor. For this is the only one that cannot be learnt from anyone else, and it is a sign of natural genius, as to be good at metaphor is to perceive resemblances." Quintilian's rhetorical account is less philosophical, but no less important. He classifies metaphors by the kinds of things substituted for one another, and famously says that metaphor is a shortened simile. Later readers have made this the foundation of a substitution view, as if metaphor were a decorative word that could always be replaced by a literal equivalent. Soskice will reject that conclusion, but she first refuses to attribute it too hastily to Quintilian himself. His concern is the training of a speaker, and his examples show that figures alter not only isolated words, but the thought and structure of sentences. The origins of the substitution view. The substitution reading becomes tempting when Aristotle's transfer is treated as a mechanism. If a word has a proper home and is carried into a foreign one, it seems that metaphor simply exchanges the proper term for an ornamental substitute. The metaphor can then be translated back into literal language, and its cognitive work is declared complete. This picture has been remarkably durable because it fits a particular suspicion. If philosophy seeks truth and rhetoric seeks persuasion, figurative language belongs to persuasion and must be watched as a possible source of confusion. Soskice locates the stronger source of this suspicion not in Aristotle or Quintilian, but in their empiricist critics. Plato's criticism of sophistic rhetoric, and later the philosophical preference for mathematical clarity, encouraged a division between the tongue and the brain, between elegant speech and wise thought. Locke gives the position its most powerful expression when he says that figurative language is suitable for pleasure, but should be excluded wherever truth and knowledge are concerned. On this view, metaphor is a pretty covering over a thought that ought to have been stated plainly. The difficulty is that the plain thought is often not available before the metaphor. Aristotle's God-created flame, the evening of life, and the neck of a bottle do not merely clothe an antecedent literal description. They extend the vocabulary by giving form to something for which the speaker had no ready term. Even a tired metaphor such as "he is a fox" does not mean exactly what "he is cunning" means. The fox carries a network of associations, and the metaphor selects, organizes, and perhaps enlarges them. To call metaphor an expendable substitute is therefore to assume the very literal equivalent whose prior existence the metaphorical act may have made possible. Transfer. The etymology of metaphora names a carrying across, but does not explain what is carried, from where, or into what kind of new use. Extension. Metaphor can enlarge language, filling a lexical gap, or opening a new field of description rather than merely decorating an old one. Name and world. The ancient dispute over whether words fit things by nature or convention returns whenever metaphor alters what a word can say about the world. Rhetoric, philosophy, and the misreading of ornament. The history of rhetoric complicates the familiar opposition between ornament and truth. The object of rhetoric was not simply to win by verbal trickery. It was to move the will by good reasoning well presented. Cicero objects to separating wise thinking from elegant speaking because the two belong together. The severance is itself a historical mistake, one that allows philosophers to imagine that language is a transparent vessel for thought, and that style merely paints the vessel's exterior. This matters especially for theology. Christian speech about God has always moved through figures, yet the presence of metaphor has increasingly been treated as a liability. If Christians pass from father to king, shepherd to judge, light to rock, how can their language be said to have sense? The critic demands an unequivocal statement behind the imagery. Soskice's historical lesson prepares her answer. Before asking whether religious metaphor can refer, we must stop assuming that metaphor is a second-rate form of saying what could have been said more literally. The very distinction between literal and figurative speech may conceal an impoverished theory of language. The classical accounts are therefore not valuable because they solve the modern problem. They are valuable because they place metaphor near the beginning of the questions that matter: naming, extension, resemblance, thought, and world. To read them well is to recover a more generous premise. Metaphor is not what remains after thought has finished. It is one of the ways thought finds its subject. Quote, "The changes involved concern not merely individual words, but also our thoughts and the structure of our sentences." Chapter 2. Problems of definition. A minimal definition. Anyone who has tried to define metaphor encounters the reason for proceeding cautiously. Definitions multiply because the interests of the literary critic, psychologist, physicist, philosopher, and theologian are not the same. A definition useful for poetry may be too loose for philosophy of science. A definition useful for semantics may miss what a theologian needs to say about God. Soskice therefore seeks not a final formula that settles every discipline, but a minimal definition broad enough to travel and precise enough to prevent category mistakes. Her working definition is deliberately spare. Metaphor is the figure of speech whereby we speak about one thing in terms that are seen to be suggestive of another. Speaking marks metaphor as language used rather than oral performance. Thing includes objects, states of affairs, moral life, a people's temperament, or the growth of the soul, and seen to be suggestive appeals to the competence of speakers who know how the language works. The definition identifies metaphor without pretending to explain its mechanism. Quote, "Metaphor is that figure of speech whereby we speak about one thing in terms which are seen to be suggestive of another." Metaphor as language use. The first danger is to define metaphor as a mental event. Literary critics may speak fruitfully of vision, imagination, fusion, or a sudden perception of relation, but a philosopher who makes such language definitional risks losing the object of study. If metaphor is primarily an act in the mind, where should we look for it? The metaphor is a figure of speech. It may provoke perceptions and associations beyond the words given, but those associations remain language-linked. They are not a mysterious event that sometimes receives a verbal costume. Soskice distinguishes a nominal definition, which lets us identify a case, from a functional account, which tells us how the case works. The first need not contain the second. A definition that imports psychological terminology in order to explain function can become cumbersome and misleading, making metaphor look like a process or event rather than a mode of linguistic use. This distinction also preserves the possibility of investigating metaphor in a linguistic setting before deciding what cognitive or theological work it performs. Physical objects are not metaphors either. Daffodils may symbolize rebirth, or they may provide an analogy for rebirth, and a speaker may construct a metaphor using them. But the flowers themselves are not linguistic figures. The distinction is not an attack on the preacher's looseness. It is necessary when we want to separate metaphor from symbol, image, model, myth, and analogy. If every conceptual transfer is called metaphor, the category becomes too broad to explain anything. Quote, while the implications of metaphor may go beyond the utterance, they're not necessarily extralinguistic. Structure, scope, and context. Metaphor does not have one syntactic form. It may appear as a verb in the smoke danced, as a noun in the dance of the seasons, or as a participle in dancing waters. Nor must it be an assertion. God is our Heavenly Father. Is God our Heavenly Father? And Heavenly Father, come to our aid, can all be metaphorical uses. The familiar A is B construction has dominated philosophical examples, but it cannot be allowed to define the phenomenon. The same caution applies to structure. Theories that require two distinct terms or subjects work tolerably for man is a wolf, but fail for writhing script. Darker purposes, the children flew to the window, and a nimbus of despair. If one invents an invisible second subject to save the theory, the account has begun to protect itself rather than describe language. Metaphor is recognized by semantic and pragmatic criteria, not by a grammatical template. Nor is the word the necessary unit of metaphor. Life is a parade becomes metaphorical because of what parade does in the utterance. Blossoms of smoke cannot be understood without context, which determines whether the image concerns grayness, billowing, emptiness, or some combination. A sentence can establish a metaphor, but a larger dialogue may be required. The example of a cold coal to blow at becomes metaphorical only when the surrounding exchange makes clear that the speaker is discussing the slim chance of a royal pardon rather than an actual coal. Establishing a metaphor begins when a hearer can recognize one thing being spoken of in terms suggestive of another. Extending, the metaphor may gather further implications, but if its elaboration makes us forget the subject it was meant to illuminate, it becomes an overgrown conceit. Context, shared beliefs, speaker intention, and the surrounding utterance help determine whether an unusual phrase is metaphor, nonsense, or ordinary extension. The chapter's negative conclusions are therefore constructive. Metaphor is not a mental event, not a physical object, not a grammatical species, and not necessarily a single word or sentence. What remains is not an empty definition, but an open field, a linguistic practice whose cognitive force must be explained without smuggling its explanation into the definition. Chapter 3. Theories of Metaphor. Substitution and Emotive Theories. The theories of metaphor are distinguished by what they think metaphor accomplishes. Substitution theories see a decorative way of saying what could have been said literally. Emotive theories deny metaphor any distinctive cognitive content and reserve its force for effect. Incremental theories hold that metaphor can say something that cannot be said adequately in another way. Soskice classification is not a neutral catalog. It is a map of the argument's pressure, whether metaphor is an ornament on thought, a stimulus to feeling, or a vehicle of thought itself. The basic substitution theory treats metaphor as an improper word standing in for a proper one. He is a fox becomes he is cunning. The metaphor may relieve boredom, beautify prose, or make intellectual matters accessible to those who cannot take them in abstract terms, but it adds no cognitive content. Soskice finds the theory untenable. Even a tired metaphor carries more than the proposed literal substitute. The fox suggests a style of cunning, a pattern of behavior, perhaps persistence, stealth, or predatory intelligence. To say that the metaphor is replaceable is not yet to show that the replacement preserves what the speaker wanted to say. The comparison version improves the account only superficially. This house is like a beehive appears to translate. This house is a beehive into a literal comparison. But a strong metaphor may disclose a resemblance not previously noticed. The metaphor is not a report about two objects already known to be alike. It may make the likeness available in the first place. Comparison describes an antecedent relation. Metaphor can create a field in which new relations become visible. The emotive theory goes further in denying cognition. Because a phrase such as a sharp wind cannot be tested in the way the sharpness of a knife can, The theory treats its force as emotional rather than cognitive. Soskice's objection is decisive. What is this emotive import, if not a response to some cognitive content? A sharp wind and a sharp wit do not release the same emotion, and the difference depends on the associations the metaphor directs us to consider. Emotion is not the alternative to cognition here. It is often cognition felt. The same issue appears in religious language. To call religious metaphor merely effective is to say that its ability to move the will survives precisely because its claim to describe anything has been removed. But a religious image can summon awe, fear, repentance, or love only because it is taken to say something about God and our relation to God. The cognitive claim need not be exhausted by a literal paraphrase, but cannot simply disappear. Substitution. Metaphor is a decorative replacement for an available literal expression. Comparison. Metaphor makes a comparison between antecedently similar things. Emotive. Metaphor lacks cognitive content and derives its force from feeling. Incremental. Metaphor contributes an irreplaceable cognitive increment to understanding. Beardsley's controversion theory. Monroe Beardsley's controversion, later verbal opposition, theory tries to explain metaphor formally through conflict within the meanings of the terms. Metaphysical streets is metaphorical because metaphysical and streets are logically incompatible at the central level of their meanings. The hearer therefore shifts from designation to connotation. The streets may wander, like a metaphysical argument, and the marginal associations of the modifier become available. This theory has two attractions. It explains why an odd expression alerts us to metaphor rather than inviting a literal reading, and it recognizes that metaphor can bring previously unnoticed connotations to life. Words do not carry every implication in active consciousness before use. A new context can select a possibility that was latent in the word's associative field. Rubber hopes or rubber melody may yield a strange new meaning because the subject singles out an unnoticed feature of rubber. But the formal account makes the metaphorical conflict too internal to language. It cannot explain man is not a wolf, which can be metaphorical without the positive clash of the usual example, or the cold coal, whose metaphorical force depends upon a conversation. Nor can it distinguish metaphor from nonsense without importing speaker intention and context. If any two terms have broad enough connotations, then man is a stone and mirrors or trees become metaphors by the same test, and the theory has eliminated nonsense rather than explained metaphor. The hierarchy of central and marginal properties also fails to scale. It may be possible to distinguish defining and accidental traits for wolf, but what would count as the necessary property of giddy in giddy brink or metaphysical in metaphysical streets? Beardsley's account begins with a useful observation about semantic tension, but ends by treating the reader's metaphorical construal as if it were generated by a rule already contained in the terms. Black's interactive theory. Max Black's interactive theory is more fertile. Drawing on I.A. Richards, Black says that a metaphor such as the poor are the Negroes of Europe brings a primary subject and a subsidiary subject into interaction. The subsidiary subject supplies a system of associated commonplaces that filters and organizes our view of the primary subject, emphasizing certain features and suppressing others. The metaphor does not merely compare the poor with an antecedently understood group. It puts the poor in a new light. The theory's strength is its insistence that metaphor is cognitively irreplaceable and socially situated. The speaker and hearer need not agree that wolves really are cruel or clannish. They need only share enough associations for the metaphor to work. Meaning arises in use, in a context where words, beliefs, and purposes meet. Black also suggests a reciprocal effect. If men are illuminated by wolves, wolves become more human in the light of the metaphor. Quote, this use of a subsidiary subject to foster insight into a principal subject is a distinctive intellectual operation, demanding simultaneous awareness of both subjects, but not reducible to any comparison between the two. Yet Black's own language strains against his insight. Filtering, suggests that the likeness was already present and merely selected, while interaction suggests a mutual alteration. His later appeal to isomorphism, analogy, and structural correspondence brings him near the comparison theory he meant to defeat. The insistence that every metaphor has two distinct subjects also limits the account to expressions such as man is a wolf. It cannot naturally handle giddy brink, writhing script, or angry wind, where the second term is not a second subject. Soskice's criticism is therefore not a rejection of interaction, but a correction of its unit. The important interaction is not necessarily between two things. It may be between the associative possibilities of terms within a whole utterance. Interanimation, model, and reference. Soskice turns to Richards for the account that comes closest to the needed theory. Richards's key claim is that the senses of words are not fixed pieces assembled like mosaic tesserae before the sentence begins. They are resultants of the interpretive possibilities of the whole utterance. Metaphor is an interanimation of words, and the familiar distinction between tenor and vehicle marks not two subjects, but the subject matter and the mode in which it is presented. In a stubborn and unconquerable flame, Slash creeps in his veins and drinks the streams of life. The tenor is fever, which is never explicitly named. The vehicle is flame, but the flame is itself modified by the language of a beast that creeps and drinks. The metaphor's meaning is not found by selecting a single replacement for fever. The tenor and vehicle cooperate, and the vehicle may contain subsidiary vehicles that continue to animate the description. This is why Soskice calls her account interanimation. A metaphor has a unity of subject matter, but draws upon two or more associative networks. The phrase tattered scruples need not contain two subjects. The associations of tattered and scruples can still animate one another. The model is the second level of the account. Metaphor does not merely combine unusual terms. It suggests a model that allows the reader to go on extending the significance. Writhing script may evoke twisting, squirming, snakes, paper on a fire, or a person in pain. The model is not always explicit, and its latent character is often part of the metaphor's power. The model also explains why a metaphor can work without a striking oddity. A poet's work may be said to flow, run smoothly, be full, steady, or deep. Taken one by one, these are ordinary predicates. Taken together, they invite the model of a river. It is the accumulated pattern that makes the metaphorical construal available. The account also preserves the hearer's work. A metaphor is not recognized by a mechanical collision of terms alone. The hearer must decide, from intention, context, shared belief, and the possibility of extending the utterance, whether the speaker is speaking metaphorically rather than nonsensically. The model gives direction to the inference. It explains why life is a circus, opens one set of implications, and not every resemblance the hearer might invent. One subject matter. The metaphor is not a sentence about two reference, but a description of one subject through a second associative field. Tenor and vehicle. The tenor is what is being spoken of. The vehicle is the language and model through which it is illuminated. Associative networks. Terms bring histories, commonplaces, and latent possibilities into the utterance without fixing a second object of reference. Model. A metaphor's underlying model lets the reader extend, test, and inhabit the new description. The distinction between sense and reference completes the chapter. A term may have a sense and denotation in the language, but reference is something a speaker makes by using an utterance in a context. The metaphor's reference is not split between the terms it contains. It is the reference affected by the speaker's employment of the whole utterance. That utensil, Churchill's description of Mussolini, can refer to Mussolini while drawing upon the associative network of utensil. The metaphor therefore achieves a unity of subject matter and plurality of associations. It gives us what Johnson called two ideas for one, without giving us two subjects. Quote, "The metaphor is cognitively unique." Chapter 4. Metaphor amongst tropes. Model, symbol, myth, and allegory. Modern philosophical accounts often mention simile, analogy, model, or symbol while avoiding the old study of tropes. Soskice argues that this avoidance is unnecessary. If distinctions among figures bear on cognitive function, then tropology should not be abandoned but reconsidered. This is especially true in religious language, where figures are not merely ornaments, but vessels of insight and vehicles of cognition. The first distinction is between metaphor and model. A model is an object or state of affairs viewed in terms of another, and it need not be linguistic. A model train is not a metaphor. When the computer is used as a model for the brain, and one speaks of neural programming. However, the language is metaphorical because the term has been projected from the model's source into its subject. In theology, fatherhood may function as a model for thinking about God. God's loving concern for his children is metaphorical speech made on the basis of that model. Symbol, image, and analogy also include non-linguistic categories. Allegory and satire are linguistic but differ in scope and intention. Their locus is commonly the text, and they speak of one thing in the guise of another, often with an oblique or dissembling purpose. Metaphor, by contrast, intends to speak directly about its subject in terms suggestive of another. Myth belongs to narrative or textual analysis, rather than to the classification of figures of speech. The practical warning is precise. A person can be a symbol, a text can be an allegory, and a story can be a myth, but a person is not literally a metaphor. Metonymy and synecdoche. Synecdoche uses a species for a genus or a genus for a species. 20 sails entered the harbor means 20 ships. Metonymy uses an adjunct for the whole. The White House said means the presidential authority of the United States. Both are oblique forms of direct reference. The hearer who wonders whether the shutters opened their mouths or whether sails arrived without ships has failed to understand the figure. Metaphor differs because it does not simply point to an absent term. It casts up and organizes a network of associations. When C.E. Cummings says that nobody, not even the rain, has such small hands, the metaphor invites us to consider what rain's hands might be. Fragile, delicate, able to reach the smallest places. The metaphor creates a new vision rather than disguising a predetermined reference. Quote, a strong metaphor compels new possibilities of vision. Simile and catachresis. Simile is usually marked by like, as, or not unlike, but its grammatical difference from metaphor does not settle its cognitive function. A dull simile, such as these biscuits are like cement, would not become profound by deleting like. Conversely, Flaubert's image of human language as a cracked kettle on which we beat out tunes for bears to dance to is not intellectually diminished by its simile form. Both metaphor and simile can compare to similars and disclose a relation not previously attended to. Soskice distinguishes illustrative from modeling similes. An illustrative simile compares two known entities point by point, as when reasons bloom as thick as buttercups. A modeling simile, like Henry James's garden plot attached to a deer park, provides a schema that can be developed. It is close in function to metaphor and may become metaphorical when a like is removed. The right question is not whether metaphor is superior to simile, but which form serves the speaker's purpose and epistemic situation. Catachresis phys alexikalgap. The foot of a mountain, leg of an angle, stem of a wine glass, leaf of a book, and dead end supply names where no straightforward term was available. Simile cannot perform this work, because an is-like clause does not become a new lexical item. Metaphor is more powerful still. It can not only fill a gap, but create a new conceptual apparatus. Electrical current suggests flow and damming. Fate as a mistress permits talk of her whims and favors. The brain as a computer generates input, feedback, programming, and databanks. Illustrative simile. A comparison whose implications are narrow and whose purpose is precision or emphasis. Modeling simile. A comparison that provides a developing schema for something less familiar or less fully grasped. Catachresis. A metaphorical extension that supplies a missing term, though metaphor can exceed naming and generate new categories of thought. Analogy in religious speech. Linguistic analogy is a stretched but accustomed use of a word in a new application. If beings on another planet communicate through fibers on their bodies, we would naturally say that they told us something or made a comment. The words would be extended, not imaginatively strained into metaphor. Riding once belonged to horses and now belongs to bicycles. The term has learned an old word new tricks without presenting a latent model. This distinction is important for theology. Aquinas uses analogy as a middle way between univocal terms, which have one straightforward sense, and equivocal terms, whose senses have no relation. Tom is happy, and the song is happy are not identical uses, but they are related. The song may cause happiness. Soskice sets aside Aquinas' full ontological account to preserve the linguistic distinction, while noting that Aquinas does not say everything predicated of God is analogical. Terms such as one, wise, and good may be applied analogically. Heavy, sweet, or happy may be metaphorical instead. Analogy begins without a jolt and does not depend on a latent model. Metaphor generates a new perspective and may alter the conceptual frame within which questions are asked. Thus, when Christians speak of the church as the body of Christ or the pilgrim people of God, the choice of figure is not neutral. A body politic suggests a head and an organized hierarchy. A ship of state makes mutiny against an incompetent captain conceivable. A pilgrim people suggests movement, dependence, and a destination not yet possessed. The theological stakes now come into view. To ask whether all religious language is metaphorical is already too crude. Scripture contains narrative, chronology, and description that are not metaphorical, and talk of God may be analogical as well as figurative. Yet when metaphor is needed to speak of what cannot be said in another way, it is not an escape from knowledge. It is one of the ways a tradition forms the conceptual and devotional world in which knowledge becomes possible. Quote, "The task of saying the unsayable is aligned to that of knowing the unknowable." Chapter 5. Metaphor and Words Proper. Dead metaphor and living models. The opposition between metaphor and words proper is one of the habits Soskice must now undo. Hobbes calls the use of metaphors, tropes, and rhetorical figures an absurdity in philosophy. Locke treats figurative speech as a means of insinuating wrong ideas and misleading judgment. The distinction survives in the language of mere metaphor, only metaphorically true and literal truth, and it becomes especially damaging when it is applied to religious speech. If literal language is identified with empirical respectability and metaphor with emotion or decoration, then theological language has already been disqualified before its claims are examined. Soskice begins by replacing the opposition between literal and metaphorical with a broader distinction between literal and non-literal speech. Irony, satire, allegory, threat, and a metaphor may all be non-literal without belonging to the same category. The distinction is made at the level of the complete utterance in context, not by assigning a questionable metaphorical sense to an isolated word. He knit his brow can be as referentially effective as he caused wrinkles to appear on his brow. The former is metaphorical in manner, not inferior in truth. Quote, "To say that a statement is metaphorical is a comment on its manner of expression and not necessarily on the truth of that which is expressed. Dead metaphor complicates the picture. Ordinary and technical language is full of expressions that began figuratively and became accustomed. The stem of a glass, the leaf of a book, the flow of electricity, the leg of a table. Once lexicalized, the usage becomes part of the dictionary and functions literally for contemporary speakers, though reflection can still recover its metaphorical origin. Richards treats dead metaphor as still active. Black excludes it from metaphor altogether. Soskice retains the category because the relation to a former model remains theoretically and historically illuminating. 3 rough tests distinguish living from dead metaphor. A living metaphor generates tension. Do winds really howl? Do poplars sigh? Is someone truly in a stranglehold? A dead metaphor creates little tension because the juxtaposition has become ordinary. A living metaphor is also less readily paraphrased. The heart of the matter can be rendered as the center of the issue, while giddy brink requires an expansion in which the brink itself seems to stagger and whirl. Most importantly, a living metaphor suggests a model. Pressure is mounting, and we need to let off steam, still carry, however faintly, the steam boiler into political thought. Literal and non-literal speech. The distinction between living and dead metaphor must not become a theory that language constantly deceives us. The strong metaphor thesis, found in different forms in Vico, Bruno Snell, Owen Barfield, Derrida, and Lakoff and Johnson, sees language as constitutive of the human world. This insight has force. Minds are formed in language, and the metaphors by which a culture speaks of mind, society, religion, and nature can shape what its members notice. But it becomes an error when etymology is treated as current meaning or when every dead metaphor is declared a hidden myth controlling thought. Snell's account of the Greek discovery of mind shows the fertile version of the thesis. The psyche is breath, the thymos an organ of emotion, the nous a receiver of images. Knowledge is associated with sight, understanding with hearing, and know-how with practical ability. Such terms are not merely labels pasted onto a pre-existing mental world. They help make the world of intellectual and spiritual experience available for reflection. Vico similarly sees figurative language as chronologically prior to what later speakers call literal description, and Berlin captures the insight. Linguistic forms are keys to the mental, social, and cultural life of the communities that use them. Soskice resists the stronger cultural psychologism. The prophets who spoke of God as shepherd, planter, husband, or fountain of living water were not necessarily unconscious of figuration simply because they lacked a technical Greek vocabulary for naming it. Their proliferation of images may show not confusion, but an awareness that no single image adequately captures the God who cannot be comprehended. A community can use a figure knowingly without possessing a modern theory of metaphor. Nietzsche's mobile army of metaphors pushes the argument in another direction. Truths are worn-out metaphors that have forgotten their figurative origin, and human beings deceive themselves when they treat their own classifications as fixed and binding. Wittgenstein and Ryle offer a more restrained warning. Pictures and language can hold philosophers captive, and ordinary grammar can tempt them into treating the mind as a place inhabited by inner objects. Turbain turns this into an admonition to distinguish using a model from being used by it. The warning is valuable, but becomes absurd when every dead metaphor is treated as a mythic prison. We would need madness rather than rigor to remain consciously alert to the origins of every tongue, of a shoe, flow of conversation, or corner of the world. More importantly, literal language also categorizes and reforms experience. To reform an alcoholic differs from curing an illness. To modernize a town differs from destroying it. To bomb a strategic hamlet differs rhetorically from bombing a village. The danger is not metaphor alone, but language as a whole. The proper target is therefore the living metaphor that actively structures a model. George Eliot's example of the brain as an intellectual stomach shows how changing the metaphor changes the questions available. The mind can be treated as a digestive organ, a blank sheet, a mirror, or something else. Each picture opens some inquiries and closes others. Metaphor is neither a transparent window nor an automatic trap. It is a frame whose power must be examined. Living metaphor retains tension, resists complete paraphrase, and suggests a model that can organize further thought. Dead metaphor has become accustomed and lexicalized, though its former model may still be recovered and may still influence conceptual habits. Strong metaphor thesis correctly recognizes language's formative power but overreaches when it confuses etymology with current meaning or blames metaphor for the work of all description. Metaphorical meaning and truth. The synchronic question is whether words have metaphorical meanings in addition to their literal meanings. Soskice answers no, at least not in the relevant sense. Words can have several literal senses through polysemy, and a usage can hover between an established sense and a living figure, but metaphorical meaning belongs to the complete utterance in its context. The north wind charged the trees does not require a new dictionary sense of charged. The oddity lies in predicating command of the wind. Nor does every metaphor have two meanings, one literal and one metaphorical. A sentence such as "her ears were seashells" may be ambiguous before context, just as "the chicken is ready to eat" may be ambiguous. But once the speaker's intention and context are grasped, the hearer normally arrives at one meaning. In Virginia Woolf's description of Mrs. Ramsay's grief as a shaft, a tear, and waters receiving it, the alternative to metaphor is not a second literal sense. It is failure to understand. The same applies to truth. A metaphorical utterance is not simultaneously literally false and metaphorically true merely because its sentence, isolated from context, can be read literally. The claim made by the utterance must be assessed at the level of intended meaning. A warning that a wire is live may be metaphorical in origin without being a lesser truth. Aquinas' account of Scripture is instructive. When Scripture speaks of God's arm, the literal sense is not that God has a physical limb, but the power signified by the arm. Figurative form does not create a second, inferior kind of truth. Soskice engages Paul Ricoeur's more elaborate account of split reference and metaphorical truth. Ricoeur speaks of literal sense and metaphorical sense, literal reference and secondary reference, and the tension between an ontological is and a critical is not. Soskice acknowledges the value of Ricoeur's attention to reference, but argues that the duality arises from confusing plural associative significance with divided referential intent. "Her ears are seashells" can have a plurality of implications while referring to one person's ears. The metaphor's alternative is not an impossible literal reference, but no reference under that construal. This matters for theology because declaring a phrase metaphorical does not settle its ontological significance. Whether "Jesus is the Lamb of God," "Jesus is the Son of God," or "this bread is my body" is metaphorical in a linguistic sense does not decide what the phrase refers to or signifies. The real question is what the metaphor is doing: ornamental redecryption, or catechetical disclosure of something new. That is a question for metaphysics and theology, not a shortcut supplied by the label metaphor. Irreducibility. The demand for reducibility is the final form of the word's proper objection. A metaphor, it is said, is cognitively meaningful only if it can be translated without loss into literal language. Hall Edwards calls an irreducible metaphor unintelligible and non-cognitive. Soskice replies that the criticism is either empty or false. If a passage admits no elaboration at all, we would have no grounds for calling it a metaphor. But if it can be extended, then its irreducibility is part of its operation. Scientific and ordinary language provide the counterexamples. Stabbing pain, gnawing pain, I see what you mean, Cold War, and stream of consciousness remain meaningful even when no strict literal paraphrase is available. The camel as the ship of the desert evokes a swaying motion, a precious cargo, a wilderness, routes, stars, and distant ports. Saying merely camel loses the relational community the metaphor makes available. Religious metaphor is not uniquely defective because it often requires further metaphorical explanation or lacks an independently ostensible referent. Physical theory also speaks through models of entities and states that cannot be directly observed. Teresa of Avila describes contemplative prayer as a babe at the breast, a garden watered by rivers and fountains, bees returning to a hive, or a journey across the sea. Her problem is not that God is transcendent and therefore language fails by definition. She is trying to guide novices into human experiences for which the ordinary lexicon is insufficient. Quote, "There are many areas where, if we do not speak figuratively, we can say very little." Irreducibility is thus not a failure to be repaired by stripping away the vehicle. It is the mark of a metaphor's relational and exploratory power. The metaphor does not conceal a complete literal sentence waiting behind it. It gives the hearer a way to enter a field of relations that the literal substitute would leave untouched. This is why metaphor matters to the theology of transcendence. It permits a tradition to speak toward God without confusing a figure's adequacy with a definition's mastery. Chapter 6. Model and Metaphor in Science and Religion. Metaphor in Scientific Language. The question of metaphor's cognitive force becomes a question of reality depiction when Soskice turns to science. A metaphorical form does not automatically produce a peculiar or defective reference. Gnawing pain can refer straightforwardly, and the eye of a needle may have become ordinary speech. The issue arises when a metaphor supplies a way of talking about less tangible entities and relations, as with moral vision, the stream of consciousness, or the field of magnetism. There the metaphor generates a network of predicates and a way of explaining. The claim that science uses metaphor only to explain difficult theories to lay readers is too weak. Bertrand Russell's account of seeing Jones invokes light quanta shooting from the sun, atoms whose internal economy is upset, rods and cones receiving a current, and an event produced in the brain. The language is not mere illustrative garnish. It is constitutive of the account's intelligibility. Scientific terminology can become dead and cipher-like, but the metaphors at the growing edge of inquiry remain active because they suggest explanatory possibilities. Quote, "The most interesting, both linguistically and scientifically, of the metaphors in theoretical language are those which suggest an explanatory network. Theory constitutive metaphors. Soskice keeps model and metaphor distinct while insisting on their intimacy. A model is an object or state of affairs viewed as standing in certain relations to another. A metaphor is language that speaks of one thing in terms suggestive of another. Metaphors arise when we speak on the basis of models. The computer can function as a model for the brain, and programming, input, output, and feedback become metaphorically constituted theory terms. This distinction matters because a theory-constitutive metaphor proposes a model, while later metaphorical terms develop the model's projections. The brain as computer sentence does one kind of work. Talk of neural programming does another. The source and subject of the model can differ. A miniature train is a homeomorphic model whose source and subject belong to the same kind. Billiard balls used to think about gas molecules are a paramorphic model whose source and subject differ. The sciences use paramorphic models to give form to what is not yet fully understood. Theory constitutive metaphor. A metaphor that proposes a model for thinking about an unfamiliar domain. Metaphorically constituted theory term. A term such as feedback or programming projected from the model and used to articulate the new domain. Paramorphic model. A model whose source and subject differ, allowing a familiar structure to make an unfamiliar one thinkable without making them identical. The comparison of models. Theological apologists have often compared models in science and religion by listing superficial similarities. Both domains use models to handle complexity, speak of what eludes immediate experience, and build coherent discourse. Soskice finds such comparisons insufficient. The real question is whether the models are explanatory and reality depicting, or whether religious models are merely evocative devices for organizing human feeling. The composite apologetic argument says that scientific models explain causal mechanisms, while religious models evoke response. Scientific models are precise and dispensable, while religious models are personal, vague, qualified, and irreplaceable. If this division were correct, the comparison would have no force. The religious apologist would be borrowing the prestige of science while conceding that religious models do not do the cognitive work of models elsewhere. Soskice examines Faray and David Tracy as examples of this unstable middle position. Faray grants religious models conceptual unity and coherence, but retreats from truth and reference into value. Tracy treats the reference of parables as Christian limit experiences, such as radical faith and agapic love. But the parable of the unrighteous judge does not merely redescribe a Christian lifestyle. It purports to tell us about God's vindication of those who cry to him. To shift the referent from God to human experience is not to solve the problem of reference, but to move it, and then ask us to forget the move. Explanatory and effective models. The central dichotomy between explanatory and effective models does not stand. A religious model may evoke a moral, emotional, or spiritual response, but it does so because it is taken to be in some sense explanatory. Isaiah's bloody imagery has the power to provoke repentance because it purports to say something about an angry God. The model of God as Father evokes trust because it is taken to disclose how God relates to those who pray. This does not mean that religious models provide exhaustive explanations. A model is not a replica of its subject. It suggests a structure, highlights some relations, suppresses others, and is qualified by the wider theory and tradition in which it functions. God as Father does not imply that God has a wife. Billiard balls as a model for gas molecules do not imply that molecules are plastic. Both scientific and religious models are constrained by received experience, theoretical assumptions, and the consequences of extending the model. The second supposed difference, that scientific models are dispensable while religious models are not, also collapses under scrutiny. A theory without a living model may be a dead formalism, unable to suggest possibilities or guide prediction. Campbell compares the analogy to the melody of a sonata. Hesse argues that positive, negative, and neutral analogies within a model provide the areas where investigation can continue. Models can be revised or replaced, but their revision may mean revising or replacing the theory itself. They're not disposable decorations. The comparison does not erase the difference between science and religion. Religious models are embedded in scripture and worship, and the transcendence of God imposes a distinctive humility. But the difference is not that science explains while religion merely affects. Both use models to project beyond what is immediately given. Both must qualify their projections. Both depend upon a community that knows how to interpret the model and to judge when its extension has become absurd. The action-guiding character of a model makes the point. If God is our Father, the model does not merely give a warm picture of the human condition. It licenses the practice of approaching God without fear, expecting hearing rather than abandonment. The model guides prayer because it is taken to depict a relation. To reduce it to an evocative symbol of human trust would leave the action without the reason that makes it religiously intelligible. Quote, if they explain nothing, they provide no basis for any response, religious or moral. The chapter therefore leaves the reader at the threshold of realism. To grant religious models explanatory and projective force is to make the problem of reference unavoidable. Soskice does not pretend that the scientific analogy proves theological realism. She argues instead that the analogy becomes intellectually useful only when both domains are treated as cognitive practices whose models can be revisable, qualified, and yet genuinely directed toward reality. Chapter 7. Metaphor, Reference, and Realism. Reality depiction and scientific realism. Ronald Hepburn states the problem with precision. If the circle of myth, metaphor, and symbol is closed, how can propositions about God refer? Soskice prefers the phrase reality depiction because the issue is not whether metaphor has a strange kind of reference, but whether language can be directed toward reality without claiming an exhaustive description of it. The answer requires a more careful account of models in science and a rejection of both naive realism and a retreat from reference. Naive realism imagines that science makes invisible structures immediately present and describes things as they are in themselves. Its theological counterpart would say that God simply gets angry, hardens his heart, or sits as king in exactly the same descriptive sense in which observable beings have these properties. Soskice rejects this without hesitation. A model is not a transparent duplicate of its subject, and a metaphor is not an unqualified photograph. The positivist retreat to observables is no better. Logical empiricism treats observation language as clear and theoretical language as parasitic. Electrons, fields, and subatomic particles become useful logical or psychological devices because they lack direct observational correlates. But much of scientific practice is concerned with hypothetical entities and relations. A science that could speak only of what is immediately observed would be unable to explain its own most successful theoretical terms: positivism, idealism, and critical realism. Critical scientific realism preserves the explanatory aim of science while refusing the naive claim to final description. Scientific investigation gives us access to structures that exist independently of us, even when those structures cannot be directly observed. Idealism, by contrast, treats models as indispensable human constructions whose objects are not independent of human activity. Soskice notes the shared assumption beneath positivism and idealism. Both make non-observational terms heuristic fictions and leave no room for the ontological questions generated by actual inquiry. The history of the gene illustrates the problem. The term was introduced to name an unknown bearer of acquired characteristics and was discussed through metaphors of information and communication. Later research altered the theory and located genetic inheritance in chromosomes. If gene had always been a useful fiction, there would have been no reason to investigate whether it had independent existence, no continuity of reference across theories, and no explanation for why technological work could clarify its function. The same question appears with the neutrino and with chemical elements predicted before they were observed. Putnam's point is that the success of science would be miraculous if its terms never referred. The realist need not claim that one mature theory mirrors the world in an unrevisable way. The claim is weaker and more defensible. Theoretical terms can provide epistemic access to important causal structures, and scientific knowledge can be cumulative without being finally privileged. Bosker's distinction between transitive and intransitive objects clarifies the relation. Theories, models, and methods are transitive. They are products of scientific practice and may be replaced. The processes and structures investigated are intransitive. They are not produced by the investigator. The former are the means by which access to the latter is obtained. The question, what must the world be like for science to be possible, is not an illicit metaphysical intrusion. It is generated by scientific practice itself. Reference, community, and access. Reference is not secured by an unrevisable definition. Kripke, Putnam, and Donnellan challenge the traditional picture in which a word refers because speakers possess a conjunction of necessary and sufficient properties. Columbus can be referred to by someone whose descriptions of him are false. Gold and electricity can be used before their essences are fully known. A term can be introduced by a causal or historical chain that links speakers to the thing in question. Soskice is careful not to replace the old theory with an uncritical causal theory. Meaning and reference are more complex. A term such as which may be used in a community to refer to frightening women while its sense includes supernatural powers. A word in the language and a use of that word in a particular context do not have identical reference. The language contains senses and denotations. Speakers use utterances to refer within situations. This distinction makes metaphorical theory terms intelligible. Neural programming receives semantic placement from the computer model, but in context it is predicated of the brain, not of a computer. The model gives the term a sense, while the speaker and scientific community use it to seek a referent only partially understood. Metaphor is valuable precisely because its vagueness leaves room for revision. A term that were a terminological pinpoint before inquiry began could not guide inquiry. The continuity of reference across theory change is the crucial test. If gene were defined by an unrevisable description, then the term in an older theory and the term in a newer theory would refer to different things whenever the description changed. But geneticists understand themselves as correcting an account of one subject, not abandoning one subject for another. The same is true when a community revises what it means by mass, electricity, or natural kind. Description guides access without imprisoning the referent inside the first description. Kripke's historical chain and Putnam's division of linguistic labor make this social. Most speakers cannot identify the essential structure of gold, electricity, or neutrino, but they can use the terms because their speech is connected to communities whose specialists have investigated those things. Reference exceeds individual mastery. It is carried by tradition of use, expertise, correction, and shared attention. Donnellan's distinction between a term's sense and a speaker's reference is equally important for metaphor. The man drinking the martini can successfully identify a person who is drinking water because the speaker's contextual act of referring need not wait for an infallible description. The metaphorical utterance likewise does not refer to every object associated with its vehicle. That old battle axe can address a person without introducing a second referent, and that wolf can speak about a man without bringing an animal into the subject matter. The metaphorical term is therefore neither a mere cipher nor a transparent label. It offers a semantic foothold from which a community can investigate. Its associative network suggests possible entities, relations, and causal mechanisms. Experience and inquiry then refine, reject, or preserve those suggestions. This is why vagueness can be epistemically fruitful rather than merely defective. Naive realism. Models are transparent descriptions of things as they are, rejected as presumptuous. Positivism. Non-observational terms are heuristic devices, challenged because science depends upon theoretical entities and relations. Idealism. Models are human constructions without independent reference, challenged because it cannot explain cumulative scientific success. Critical realism. Revisable models provide epistemic access to structures that exist independently of our theorizing without becoming privileged final descriptions. Social reference. Speakers refer, through linguistic communities, traditions of inquiry, and chains of experience that exceed any individual's knowledge. The argument is not that theological statements become scientific statements. Dumet's warning against being a realist tout court is retained. Realism concerns classes of statements. What the scientific case supplies is a conceptual analogy. If metaphorical theory terms can be reality depicting in science without exhaustive definition, then a theological realist may ask whether a comparable, though not identical, form of access is possible in religious speech. Quote, "The world informs our theory, although our theory can never adequately describe the world." The final move is explicitly cautious. Metaphorical predicates generated by models may be partially denoting, reality depicting, and open to correction. Their vagueness is not a defect that disqualifies them. It is what allows a community to adapt its language to causal and explanatory features not yet fully grasped. The same structure prepares the theological chapter. Reference need not mean possession, and realism need not mean mastery. This is a realism of access rather than a realism of possession. The investigator does not stand outside language and compare a finished theory with reality from nowhere. She works through inherited models, communal standards, and experiences that can correct the vocabulary. The model is transitive and revisable, while the structures toward which it points are not made by the act of theorizing. Metaphor is useful at precisely this threshold because it gives an initially intelligible shape to what remains only partially understood. Chapter 8. Metaphor and Theological Realism. Against empiricist reduction. The final chapter applies the preceding argument to the theological realist. Don Cupid's naive realist is a Christian who worships a cosmos transcending absolute being, and the objection is that realism either becomes objectifying or ceases to be religious. Air makes the empiricist demand more sharply. Unless the theist can say exactly what God exists means, there is no intelligible proposition for faith to take hold of. The theist must choose between exhaustive definition and silence. Soskice identifies the inherited assumptions behind this demand. Cognitive claims require strict applicability, certainty, and significant description. Words have only the meanings we give them, and an approximation that falls short of exact definition cannot refer. This is the empiricist version of the conclusion that no theoretical term ever refers. It is also the conclusion that makes the use of metaphors in theology appear self-defeating. But the preceding chapters have already shown why the demand is too strong. Science itself uses models and metaphorical theory terms to refer to structures not directly observed and not exhaustively described. A metaphor can have cognitive force without being a definition. The question for theology is not whether religious speech is as scientific speech, but whether the same distinction between referring and defining can be made in the theological case. Critical theological realism. Soskice advocates critical theological realism not because it proves Christianity, but because it makes sense of a realist sensibility already present throughout Christian practice. The Christian's metaphors and models are taken to speak, however obliquely, about states and relations that are more than human. To reduce them to descriptions of human experience is not a harmless translation. It changes what the claims are about. The realist she defends is not naive. The theological language is fallible, tradition-bound, and revisable. No model defines God as God is in himself. Yet a speaker may refer without possessing an exhaustive description. The useful analogy is not a proof from science to theology, but a demonstration of conceptual possibility. Metaphorical language can be reality, depicting without being directly descriptive. The causal theory of reference offers one route. In science, electricity can be designated as whatever made the needle move. A gene can be designated as whatever is responsible for inherited traits. In theology, no one points to God with a finger, so the Christian may say that God is that which is the source and cause of all there is. Anselm's formula, that than which nothing greater can be conceived, is a designation rather than a definition. It tries to indicate what a God must be without claiming to comprehend God. The more experiential route fixes reference through events judged to be of God. This is more contested because religious experience is not repeatable in the scientific sense, and the experiencer may be mistaken. Yet the possibility of error is not a refutation of realism. The Christian realist must concede that if the source of all were radically unlike anything that could be called God, the structure of belief would be gravely damaged. Realism is therefore a risk, not a claim to immunity from correction. Quote, "The agnosticism of our formulations preserves us from this presumption, for we do not claim to describe God, but to point through his effects and beyond his effects to him. Experience, tradition, and the community of faith. Reference is grounded socially as well as causally. Scientific speakers rely on a community whose experts have more immediate access to neutrinos, genes, and electricity than any individual can possess. Religious speakers likewise belong to communities of interest whose shared practices, texts, models, and authoritative members extend individual experience. A person who speaks of the beatific vision may not have seen God, but may belong to a tradition whose mystics, scriptures, liturgies, and accumulated interpretations give the phrase its referential setting. This is not the relativist claim that each community creates its own reality. It is the realist claim that reference is made within a context of inquiry, and that contextuality does not abolish reference. The world informs the theory, even though the theory never exhausts the world. Christian experience includes dramatic events and diffuse experiences of contingency, causation, order, and dependence. When a community chooses a model to articulate these experiences, it does so as heir to an established vocabulary of interpretation. The mystic makes the process visible. John of the Cross speaks of the dark night and the cloud of unknowing. Teresa of Avila speaks of spiritual marriage and the garden. These expressions are shaped by biblical and scholastic traditions, by practices of prayer, and by the testimony of a community. Their metaphorical form does not make them non-referential, though it cannot guarantee that the experience was of God. The realist claim is modest. The terms can refer, and the speaker can still be mistaken about what caused or grounds the experience. The accumulation of favored models is itself part of revelation as Christians receive it. The community does not choose God as shepherd, king, vinekeeper, rock, or fountain at random. Each model has a history of use, gloss, liturgy, and reinterpretation. When the gospel speaks of living water, it draws upon the Exodus, the prophets, baptism, the pierced side of Christ, and the river of life in Revelation. The phrase is not an isolated image, but a node in a tradition whose prior uses become part of its present meaning. Experience. The ground from which communities begin to speak, whether dramatic religious encounter or diffuse experience of contingency, order, and cause. Tradition. The accumulated history of favored models, scriptural allusions, liturgical use, and interpretive glosses that give a metaphor its depth. Community. The network of speakers and authorities through which individuals inherit a descriptive vocabulary and gain access to experiences beyond their own. Fallibilist realism. The right to refer without the right to claim exhaustive or error-proof knowledge of the referent. Metaphor and the transcendent God. The theological realist, therefore, stands at the meeting point of cataphatic and apophatic speech. Christians say that God is Spirit, Father, King, Rock, Judge, Shepherd, or Fountain of living water, but none of these images defines God. Their senses arise within a tradition and are qualified by the way the community uses them and by the sacred texts in which they are embedded. To say God is Spirit is not to apply a dictionary definition of spirit to a divine object. It is to denominate the source of experiences and acts that Jews and Christians have interpreted through that vocabulary. This is why Soskice refuses both a closed circle of images and the empiricist demand for a language without images. The circle is not closed if metaphorical language is referentially connected to experience, community, and tradition, nor does opening the circle require pretending that the metaphor gives a direct view of God. The apophatic insight that God exceeds speech is the condition for the tentative, stammering, and necessarily metaphorical character of speech about God. The image of living water makes the point. The Samaritan well, the prophetic fountain, the rock struck in the wilderness, baptism, the water from Christ's side, and the river of life are not a set of interchangeable decorations. Each use receives and transforms the earlier ones. The metaphor carries a history of relation, and its meaning is never exhausted by a single paraphrase. John Donne's ark, flood, blood, and ship gather the sacred past into the poet's present. Experience interprets text, and text interprets experience. Quote, "The great divine and the great poet have this in common. Both use metaphor to say that which can be said in no other way, but which, once said, can be recognized by many." Soskice's conclusion is neither that metaphor proves God, nor that metaphor dissolves God into language. It is that the Christian may coherently claim to speak of God while admitting inability to define him. A reflective realism is not embarrassed by the wheel of images. It understands that the wheel is the form taken by finite speech when it reaches toward a transcended source. The language is inadequate as description and still capable of reality depiction. Its truth is not the possession of a divine object, but a faithful, communal, revisable pointing toward the one whom no image contains. Quote, "The Christian theist can reasonably take his talk of God, bound as it is within a wheel of images, as being reality depicting, while at the same time acknowledging its inadequacy as description." Conclusion. Soskice's argument begins by refusing a small word for a large task. Metaphor is not a decorative substitute placed beside proper language. It is one of the ways language extends itself toward what has not yet received a settled name. The book's historical and analytical chapters then make the refusal precise. Metaphor is a form of language use, established in context, carried by an utterance rather than an isolated word, and capable of joining one subject to a plurality of associative and model-bearing possibilities. The distinction between tenor and vehicle, corrected through the theory of interanimation, preserves unity without impoverishing plurality. There is one subject matter, but no single literal paraphrase that can retain every relation the vehicle makes available. This is why metaphor can be cognitively unique. It does not merely report a resemblance already waiting in the world. At its strongest, it discloses a resemblance, a structure, or a possibility of thought that cannot be reached by replacing the figure with a proper word. The turn to science prevents this defense from becoming a special pleading for theology. Scientific inquiry itself depends upon models and metaphorical theory terms that are vague, revisable, and directed toward structures not immediately observed. Critical realism does not promise a God's-eye view of nature. It claims that theories and communities can gain epistemic access to a world independent of them, and that the possibility of correction is compatible with reference. Soskice carries this conceptual possibility into theology without making religion a branch of science. The final theological claim is accordingly both realist and apophatic. Christians may speak of God as Father, Spirit, King, Shepherd, Rock, or living water, but none of these models contains God. Their reference is grounded through experience, scripture, tradition, and the communal labor of interpretation. Their adequacy is always partial, and their speakers remain fallible. To refer is not to define. The metaphorical wheel is not a prison from which theology must escape into abstract language, but the form finite speech takes when it points toward a transcendent source. The book's afterlife lies in this disciplined middle position. It refuses the empiricist demand that only exhaustive description can be meaningful, and it refuses the idealist temptation to turn religious language into a drama of human feeling alone. Metaphor can be cognitive without being transparent, referential without being final, and tradition-bound without being thereby unreal. The theologian's speech remains a stammer, but it is not therefore silence. Key persons discussed: Janet Martin Soskice, the author, whose philosophical theology defends metaphor as a cognitive and reality-depicting vehicle while preserving the inadequacy of every finite description of God. Aristotle, the classical theorist whose account of metaphor as transference, analogy, and the naming of what lacks a name sets the historical problem for the book. Quintilian, the Roman rhetorician whose classifications and equation of metaphor with shortened simile are later misread as a simple substitution theory. I.A. Richards, the theorist whose tenor-vehicle distinction and account of the interanimation of words provide the principal resources for Soskice's preferred theory. Max Black, the modern philosopher whose interactive theory emphasizes associated commonplaces, cognitive irreducibility, and the filtering power of a subsidiary subject, but whose two-subject model Soskice corrects. Paul Ricoeur, the philosopher whose account of metaphor, split reference, and metaphorical truth receives sustained criticism for turning plural significance into divided reference. Ludwig Wittgenstein, the philosopher whose warnings about pictures and language and the grammar of interstates helps Soskice distinguish metaphor from the philosophical errors language may encourage. Saul Kripke, Hilary Putnam, and Keith Donnellan, philosophers of reference whose work helps separate reference from exhaustive description and makes social, historical, and causal access intelligible. Ian Ramsey, Frederick Farray, and David Tracy, theologians and philosophers whose accounts of religious models illustrate both the appeal and the danger of treating religious language as merely effective or anthropological. Thomas Aquinas, the theologian whose account of analogy and intended scriptural sense supplies a crucial distinction between referring to God and defining God. Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, mystical writers whose metaphors describe religious experiences for which no established literal vocabulary is adequate within biblical and devotional traditions. Ronald Hepburn, the critic who formulates the decisive question of how the circle of myth, metaphor, and symbol can remain open to reference to God. Key works discussed: Poetics, Aristotle, the classical source for the four movements of metaphor, and the claim that metaphor is a sign of the ability to perceive resemblances. Institutio Oratoria, Quintilian, the rhetorical source for the classification of metaphors and the influential equation of metaphor with shortened simile. The Philosophy of Rhetoric, I.A. Richards, the source of tenor, vehicle, and the interanimation of words, which Soskice develops into a theory of one subject with multiple associative networks. Models and Metaphors, Max Black, the source of the interactive theory, associated commonplaces, and the distinction between primary and subsidiary subjects. The Rule of Metaphor, Paul Ricoeur, the major philosophical account used to frame and challenge claims about metaphorical sense, split reference, and metaphorical truth. The Discovery of the Mind, Bruno Snell, a historical account used to show how metaphorical language helps make the intellectual and spiritual life available for thought. Metaphors We Live by George Lakoff and Mark Johnson, a modern strong metaphor thesis that extends Soskice's concern with the way language structures thought, though she resists its more extreme implications. The Way of Perfection, Teresa of Avila, a mystical work whose metaphors of breast, garden, water, bees, and journey guide readers into experiences without a settled literal vocabulary. Philosophical Investigations, Ludwig Wittgenstein, a source for the critique of philosophical pictures and a warning that grammar can hold thought captive. Naming and Necessity, Saul Kripke, a source for reference through historical chains rather than unrevisable descriptions. Mind, Language, and Reality, Hilary Putnam, a source for the critique of traditional theories of meaning and the realist interpretation of scientific terms. Index of Key Concepts, Metaphor, a figure of speech in which one thing is spoken of in terms suggestive of another. For Soskice, its significance belongs to the complete utterance in context, and its cognitive force lies in the network and model it opens. Metaphora, the Greek term meaning carrying across. Its etymology points toward extension, but does not by itself explain what is carried or how metaphor works. Interanimation, the mutual activity of terms and associated possibilities within a whole utterance. Meaning is a resultant of context and interpretation, not a mosaic assembled from fixed word meanings. Tenor, the subject matter being spoken of in a metaphor. It is not necessarily an explicit term in the utterance, and should not be mistaken for a second subject. Vehicle, the language, image, or model through which the tenor is presented, is not a decorative shell that can be removed without changing the meaning. Associative network, the field of commonplaces, histories, properties, and latent models associated with the term. Metaphor activates and reorganizes these associations without automatically creating a second referent. Model, an object or state of affairs viewed in terms of another. A model need not be linguistic, but metaphorical language often arises when speakers speak on the basis of a model. Theory constitutive metaphor, a metaphor that proposes a model for an unfamiliar domain, such as the brain as a computer. It generates further terms such as programming, input, storage, and feedback. Paramorphic model, a model whose source and subject differ. It provides a familiar structure for thinking about what is not yet fully understood without making source and subject identical. Catachresis, the filling of a lexical gap. Metaphor can supply a missing name, but its stronger forms exceed naming by generating new categories, relations, and hypotheses. Analogy, a stretched but accustomed use of language that fits a new application without imaginative strain. It differs from metaphor because it need not invoke a latent model or new picture. Dead metaphor, a formerly vivid metaphor that has become accustomed and lexicalized. It may function literally for present speakers while retaining a recoverable relation to an earlier model. Living metaphor, a metaphor that retains semantic tension, resists complete paraphrase, and suggests a model through which the subject can be newly seen. Irreducibility, the inability to replace a metaphor with a literal equivalent without loss of relational content. Soskice treats this not as a defect, but as evidence of metaphor's cognitive utility. Reference, an act performed by speakers using expressions in contexts, not a fixed relation belonging to isolated words alone. Reference can succeed even when the speaker's description is incomplete or partly mistaken. Reality depiction, Soskice's preferred term for the question often called reference or truth in metaphor. It names a cautious, revisable orientation toward reality rather than an exhaustive mirror of reality. Critical realism, a realism that grants independent reality to the structures toward which models point while treating theories and models as revisable, socially mediated, and non-privileged. Theological realism, The claim that Christian language can refer to God and divine relations without defining God or reducing religious speech to descriptions of human experience. Apophatic and cataphatic speech. The tension between saying that God exceeds every image and using images to speak of God's acts in relation to creatures. The apophatic does not cancel the cataphatic. It keeps metaphor from becoming possession. Reading comprehension questions. What historical and philosophical questions about naming and the relation between language and the world are already present in the ancient study of metaphor? How does Soskice's minimal definition of metaphor avoid confusing a nominal definition with a functional account? Why does she insist that metaphor is a figure of speech rather than a mental event, physical object, or particular grammatical form? What does the distinction between tenor and vehicle accomplish? And why does Soskice reject treating them as two distinct subjects? How do substitution, emotive, formal, interactive, and interanimative theories differ in their accounts of metaphor's cognitive force? Why does Beardsley's verbal opposition theory fail to distinguish metaphor from nonsense without context and speaker intention? How does Soskice's account of metaphor differ from a comparison theory? And why can a metaphor create a resemblance rather than merely report one? What is the difference between a model, a symbol, an analogy, a simile, a catachresis, an allegory, and a myth? Why does Soskice distinguish illustrative simile from modeling simile? And what does the distinction reveal about epistemic distance? How can a dead metaphor remain theoretically significant after it has become an accustomed literal usage? Why does Soskice reject the claims that every metaphor has two meanings or is simultaneously literally false and metaphorically true? What does irreducibility mean, and why does it not make religious or scientific metaphor unintelligible? How do scientific models and metaphorical theory terms challenge the opposition between explanatory realism and effective religious language? What are the differences among positivism, idealism, naive realism, and critical realism in Soskice's account of models and reference? How do Kripke, Putnam, and Donnellan's separate reference from exhaustive description? And why is linguistic community important to this separation? What does Soskice mean by saying that metaphorical theological language may be reality depicting without being directly descriptive? Why does the model of God as Father guide action only if it is taken to say something about a real relation rather than merely evoke a human feeling? How do experience, scripture, tradition, and community contribute to the referential force of Christian metaphors, such as living water, shepherd, rock, and spirit? What is the risk assumed by the critical theological realist, and how does fallibilism preserve rather than destroy the seriousness of theological speech?